Hello, everyone. In this week, we will cover the foundations of deep learning. We will start with we will understand what exactly the interconnection between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning mean. We will also talk about the structure of a single neural network. We will understand the different kind of loss function, which is the logistic regression and linear regression. And the goal over here is to recognize the terminology, not to just recognize the terminology, but also to understand how inputs, weights, bias, activation functions, and loss function work together to make a better prediction. So let me start with these five components, as I mentioned. First, we will compare deep learning with classical machine learning. Then we will examine the anatomy of an artificial neuron, which is in our human brain, which is the inputs, weights, bias, activation functions, and output. Third, we will distinguish between a single neural network and a deep neural network. And we will then revisit loss functions and discuss how the model's weights affect its prediction. And finally, we will represent linear regression and logistic regression as a simple neural model. This final connection is important because it shows how neural networks builds on ideas you have already encountered rather than starting from an entirely separate mathematical framework. So let's start with it. Um, Let's start with this important structure which we have talked about, which is deep learning or neural network. So neural network is a computational model which is inspired by the idea of interconnected neurons, which are present in our human brain. The analogy of human brain is that it gives us useful way to think about how many small computational units can work together. Neural networks are used to recognize patterns and solve common machine learning problems. A neural network is constructed with the neurons by arranging these neurons into layers. When the network contains several such layers, we commonly describe this as a deep neural network, and the learning process is called as deep learning. Therefore, the key distinction is that deep learning generally refers to neural networks models with multiple layers that transform the data step by step. And this is important, is that you understand the stacked idea so that you know what exactly these neurons are, connections are connected with each other. Now, since you have understand this deep learning, what exactly this deep learning, which includes these different neural networks, the next thing I wanted you to understand is the differences between AI, ML, and deep learning. So the diagram is basically it's a nested relationship. Artificial intelligence is the broadest area. Its general aim is to make machines behave in ways that appears intelligent or resemble aspects of human behavior. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. Instead of manually writing every rule, we provide examples and allow a model to learn patterns from those examples. Deep learning is further subset of machine learning. Its distinguished idea is that the model learns a hierarchy of features directly from data. In other words, you can understand the system not only understand or not only learn the final mapping from an input to an output, its internal layers also learn increasingly useful representations of that particular input. So that's what the difference is between these three important terms, which you hear every now and then basically listen. Next is that how does this deep learning differ from classical machine learning? So the central difference is how features are obtained. In classical machine learning, we usually begin with raw data, and that raw data could be in terms of images, it could be in terms of text, and so on. And then what we do is we manually prepare or engineer the features. Those hand-designed features are then provided to a learning algorithm which produces the final prediction. And the success of the model therefore depends heavily on the quality of those selected features. Deep learning changes this pipeline, and how this changes is the model receives the raw data, learns multiple levels of features internally. Earlier, the layers learn relatively simple representations, and while later layers combine them into make more complex representation so that they are useful for the prediction task. This is what this particular slide means by the hierarchy of features or deep representation. A representation is an internal way of processing or expressing information. A simple task can be presented in a much more in a learnable manner. So, in natural language processing, combinations of characters can form words, but a single character has a different meaning. But when you group them together, they make concrete or abstract concepts such as cat, dog, or love. In computer vision, for example, combinations of pixels can form edges. They can create shapes, and they can, in the end, you can ultimately recognize the recognizable objects such as cars, people, or animals. Deep learning, that's why, allows these representations to emerge from data rather than requiring every one of them to be designed manually. And this is what the difference between the two terminology is. Now, let us examine these learned hierarchies in two specific domains, which is computer vision and our natural language processing. So, as I mentioned, the hierarchy of representation ideas appears across multiple machine learning domains. So, consider a computer vision example. At the very top, the input begins as raw pixels. An early layer may detect simple edges. A later layer can combine edges into corners and curves. Additional layer can combine those patterns into basic shapes, and still at the later layers, you can identify coherent objects, and finally you can make that as an object category, that whether it is a cat or it is a dog or it is just a wall. The important point is that each layer operates at a different level of abstraction. The model moves from low-level visual details to high-level concepts that are more closely related to the prediction task that you are doing. The lower example is in the case of natural language processing. It's the same process. The input begins as raw text, and that raw text could be in a character level. You can make it as a word level. So early processing means understanding the words. Later layers captures phrase meaning, sentence meanings, and even the meaning of the complete document. So the complete document could be a research paper. It could be a novel on fiction. A final layer can use that representation to make a final prediction and to decide whether I want to give a positive review to this particular book or a negative review to that specific book that you are learning. So although the specific representation differs across different domain, whether it is computer vision or natural language processing, the learning pattern is similar. Simple information is progressively transformed into more abstract and task-related information. So these examples also show why the architecture of network can be designed to reflect knowledge about the problem domain. And that's why we need to understand the encoding domain knowledge. So neural network architecture can incorporate, as I mentioned, domain knowledge directly into their design. This means that the structure of the model can reflect what we already know about the type of data being processed. And the architecture therefore acts as a useful prior that can make learning much easier. For natural language processing, knowledge about language, about sequential relationship can influence the overall model design. Recurrent neural network, for example, is another kind of a network designing where these were designed to process sequential information. For computer vision, knowledge could be from image processing, and it can be incorporated through convolutional neural network, which are designed to work effectively with spatial patterns in images. So the general lesson is that the deep learning does not remove the need of a human understanding of a domain. Instead, domain knowledge can guide the selection or design of an architecture that is best suited to that particular problem or a specific domain that you are discussing. Before studying these complex architectures, we will reduce the problem to the smallest useful unit, which is called as a single artificial neuron. So a complete neural network may contain many stacked layers of these interconnected components. To understand how such a system works, it is firstly to understand a single layer network. So the model is designed to represent the behavior of a simplified artificial neural network. So X1, X2, and X3 are the inputs, which is taking into this black box and which is producing the output. So the biological motivation is only an analogy. So real biological neurons are much more sophisticated. For our purposes, the perceptron, which is called as a single neural network, it receives not just 3 input, it can be a several input. It combines them using some weights and it produces an output. And once we understand this particular unit, we can understand how many such units can be connected to form much more deeper network. So now the next basically we talk about is the single layer neural network. As I mentioned, these inputs that are entering into the single neural network, these are, this is a single neural network. These are called as features. We will begin with the input, then add bias and weights, form the weighted sum and apply an activation function, and then evaluate the prediction using the final loss function. So as you can see in the diagram, this is called as a perceptron, is in a single unit entity or a setting. On the left-hand side, we have these inputs, which is X1, X2, and X3. These inputs are termed as I mentioned, features. For example, in the case of prediction problem, the features might represent measurements. It can represent attributes and encoded properties of certain observation. And a neuron receives these features, values, uses them to complete an output and shows them as a Y, which is the output. At this stage, this particular diagram is very simple. We have still not seen that how exactly neuron decides how much attention I should be giving to a single feature, which is in the case of X1, X2, or X3. So the next term, which is important in this neural network, which comes in the picture, is bias. So the diagram over here includes this additional term, which is called as B, which is the bias term. So this represents as an additional constant input to the neuron, and it is commonly associated with a constant value such as 0 or 1. So this bias participates in this neural internal calculation together with the feature input. For this particular lecture, the key point is to recognize B as a separate term in our neuron equation, which I will be showing in the consecutive slide. We will return to the behavior and representation of bias in the greater detail later. So now next comes is the next important part, which is weights. Each feature which we are including inside this term, which is X1 and X2, is associated with a weight. So W1 belongs to X1, W2 belongs to X3, W3 belongs to X3. So the weights control how much feature contributes to a particular prediction. When a weight changes, the contribution of its associated input also changes. Learning in this model, therefore, involves finding the perfect optimal weight that will produce the most optimal prediction from the available inputs that you have. And that's why having these weights are very important. Next thing which we will cover is basically talking about the activation function. So activation function is it receives. So what we are doing is we are taking these combinations of W1 and X1, W2 and X2, W3 and X3. So activation function receives this neuron's weighted input and transforms into a neuron's output. We can write this neuron input as the weighted sum, which is W1 X1 plus W1 W2 X2 W3 plus X3, given there are 3 input features, plus the bias, which is B, and then apply an activation function F onto that value. So different activation functions create different types of output behavior. This particular slide deck just gives you the general role of an activation function. We will study specific activation functions in the next consecutive module. For now, remember this sequence. Combine the inputs using weights and bias, then transform the result using this activation function. The next thing comes into picture is the loss function. So the loss function evaluates the difference between the model's prediction and the actual target value that you are basically looking for. In other words, it quantifies how far is the predicted value from the value we wanted the model to produce. The loss function depends on the model's weight because changing the weights changes the weighted sum, which changes the neuron's output and therefore changes the prediction error. Training can be viewed as an optimization problem, and we search for weights, the optimal weights that reduce or minimize those loss functions. This gives us the complete basic learning loop. Inputs enter the neurons, neuron applies weights and biases, activation function produce a prediction, and the loss function measures the quality of that particular prediction. So there are different kinds of loss function, and we can represent them in the form of linear regression or logistic function. So in linear regression can be represented as using the same neuron structure. Suppose we have D inputs, which in this case is 3. We apply this weighted function. When we apply the bias B into it, then we have this activation function, which is the function which is used for that particular prediction. And finally, the linear regression uses the same weighted output and basically helps us to produce a predicted continuous value. So it's a continuous value. Imagine it's a stock prediction that you are doing, but it gives you prediction at every time instant. That is what is a linear regression function. Logistic regression uses the same weighted input, but it changes the activation function. So what we do over here is basically, so this is what I mentioned, loss function is 1 over n with the summation of yi minus y hat, the hat, and we do the square to maximize the minimum value. So we want to maximize that this the actual versus predicted value should be minimized, and that's why we have this particular loss function, which is in the case of linear regression, which is for continuous values. Logistic regression begins with the same linear score, which is W1 times X1 plus W2 times X2, W3 times X3 plus bias. The difference is that the score is passed through a sigmoid or logistic function. And the sigmoid function is a sigma of X equals, which is sigmoid of X, which is the input, is equal to 1 over 1 plus exponential to the power of minus X. And as the graph indicates, very negative inputs produce values closer to 0, and very positive inputs produce values close to 1. So values around 0 map to the middle of this range, which is between these zeros and ones. Because the output is constrained between 0 or 1, we can interpret this as a probability. The prediction is written as y hat equals the sigmoid of the weighted sum plus the bias. And this transformation allows a linear score to support a binary classification. So logistic regression is mostly used for classification. For a linear regression is basically used for a prediction value, which is continuous in nature. So when we use a logistic regression as a neuron, then in that case, as I mentioned, this is a sigmoid being applied to our weights and inputs plus our bias. This is the neural representation. However, the loss function over here is different. Then it is not the 1 over n, the summation of yi minus y hat, the square value. So the model basically chooses weights and bias so that the probabilities do align with the observed class label, but it does apply a sigmoid function to make it as a 0 or 1 value. So the loss shown in this table is based on negative log probability. The optimization process favors parameter value that assign high probability to the correct outcomes. So the comparison with the previous slide is very important. Linear regression and logistic regression uses the same basic neuron calculation. The primary distinction is between the activation and the type of the output. Linear regression produces an unrestricted continuous value, but logistic regression uses the sigmoid to produce a value between 0 and 1. Finally, I would like to conclude this particular thing by saying that we did understand the basic concept of our neurons. We did discuss about loss function, weights, biases, and so on. And in the next lecture, we will cover more details on this. I hope this was useful. Thank you, everyone.